So hello everyone, this is the Open Documentation Community Hour, and today we have a presentation by Simon, and I suppose it's going to be introduced by Kirpana. The podium is yours.
Thanks, Robert. Hello everyone. I'm really glad that we got to do this in the Coda office hours. Let me introduce you to Simon Fels, the engineering manager of Anbox Cloud. To me, he's one of the greatest champions of documentation, being a part of the product's lifecycle right from the beginning. And I've firsthand seen this have a positive impact on the product, the user community, and the team behind it as well. So a very warm welcome to you, Simon, and thanks for doing this. Over to you.
Yes, thanks a lot, Kisana and Robert. It's really a pleasure to be here and just explain a little bit of what we have been doing over the years and how we have been trying. We are not perfect, but at least we are trying to achieve a good culture and practice around documentation in our team. But let me give a quick introduction of who I am and what I'm actually doing here. So I'm working for Canonical. With full name, I'm Simon Fels. I'm based out of the northern of Germany, and I'm currently leading the engineering team, where Kisana is also be part of, which is responsible for a product Canonical is producing called Anbox Cloud. It's what the product actually is, which I think will be important to understand so that we can dive deeper into where documentation actually comes into play and why it's such a key element of our product story. So Anbox Cloud, in essence, what it's doing, it's bringing Android, as you know it, from smartphones, from tablets, from all kinds of other mobile devices. It's bringing that to cloud environments and not to run, for example, web service or things like that. It's not about that. It's really to support use cases where you have, where you need to have remote access, for example, to Android. We have users for cloud gaming environments, which using Anbox Cloud to deploy large-scale environments and then actually stream mobile games to end-user devices on mobile handsets or even TVs. But we also have a strong user base which is using Anbox Cloud for deploying Android applications for testing or for automation. And despite the nature of Canonical, Anbox Cloud is at this moment not an open source product. So that's also where documentation comes as a strictly important element for us into the picture. And I can start a bit of explaining, and Kiswana, if you want to add to that, or if anyone has any specific questions of what I'm going to talk about, please feel to chime in. But to understand where we have been coming from in terms of documentation for Anbox Cloud, so we have been starting the product itself in 2017, 2018. So we are around for quite some time. And for those of you who know that at some point Canonical was into the business of developing a smartphone operating system called Ubuntu Touch, that's essentially where the kind of origin of the product is coming from. So in 2017 and 2018, we saw kind of interest from users into building such a solution around all of the different other software, which you know from Canonical, like Juju or other things. So we came up to start an actual product on top of this. The actual key element was from the beginning is how do we tell users how to make best use of this product, right? So we're coming with a new thing, with new kind of elements to it. How do you deploy this? How do you actually run Android applications? How do you deploy this on a specific cloud environment, for example? What kind of optimizations do you have to do? And this can be quite complicated if we talk about use cases like low latency video streaming, you can think of service like GeForce Now or Google Stadia once ago. We're talking about a similar kind of problem space. And you have a lot of things which you need to put into the picture, right? You have GPUs, you have the actual using containerization of Android, you have a higher density of multiple Android instances per machine you're running. So all of that needs kind of strong documentation, because otherwise users will just not feel like they actually understand what they are dealing with, right? And also how to solve problems and understand on how they can actually build a solution on top of this. So when we started to build the product, like documentation was one of the things we had to get out, because like otherwise we couldn't actually tell people how to install the software. So we started quite like simple in the beginning. In the beginning, it was just like a Google Doc where everything was put into, and like with a structure already. Like we moved into like a Markdown format afterwards. But it became somewhat of a necessity when we added new features. We actually wanted people to try out, and often like we did add those things on request from people, that we had to tell them how to do this, right? How to use this certain feature, because we didn't have the ability to just say, yeah, here's the code, look how it is, like you can figure that out. No, we actually had to explain that. So like by nature, we came into this kind of habit like of documenting the things we were actually implementing. Like it was a set of engineers in the beginning, and we tried our best. Like it was a set of documentation. It wasn't perfect, but with Keith Rana and others coming on board, it was really, really helpful to get a good structure and how should I say, like life cycle into the documentation, right? So like how you actually ensure that throughout the development process, when an engineer actually makes updates to documentation, you actually make sure that this also gets documented. Like nowadays, it goes as far that every PR has an element in the template where the developer has to sign off, does this has any documentation impact, right? And if it has, then your job isn't done before you actually edit the documentation for this piece of work, right? So it turned out was just a necessity in the beginning, that it became more of like a natural habit for people on the team, because it's actually how we tell people to use our software, right? I have from my personal kind of perspective, I often feel like, I've built this thing and now somebody came across, and for him it doesn't actually work. Like they did some mistake, they did something wrong. Like often the answer, if you go out, is like, yeah, here's the documentation, look it up, or like, yeah, they need to change those few keys here, and then it's actually going to work, right? I often find we can do better than that, right? Because if a user actually ran into that problem, like something on the journey to him running into that particular problem, like either it is documentation or it's software itself, can be done better, right? This is a never-ending battle, but I think, or at least that's what I've been trying to emphasize for the team, like throughout the beginning of the project, is that this is actually what we should try to solve, right? We're building something, and we're not building that necessarily for ourselves, but we're building that for people to use. And that also then comes with a strong kind of impact for people, that documentation actually matters, right? So yeah, so that's basically from the kind of perspective of where we're coming from, where we are today. Like we still have a lot of open holes in the documentation, right? So like it's not that we are complete, by no means, right? So we just recently talked about like we could do a lot more in terms of like explaining how the network setup in our like deployment actually looks like, right? Who is communicating with what, which, for example, would help a lot with troubleshooting, like, hey, I have this issue over here, what could actually contribute to this, right? And providing further insight into that is then hopefully helping people to better understand on how things are coming together, and also what is happening when I actually click a button on here, right? So, and like specifically with Keith Rana coming on board at some point, that was really like another boost for us in the team, because it also drove us toward a different perspective, and also opened for us the ability to just bring new kind of features to the product. For example, one thing which Keith Rana worked on very recently with engineers on the team is to bring into our web UI a tool which guides the user throughout the entire like UI and explains all the different elements. But the key aspect of that is also, it's not just telling you click here, click there, it's also providing the explanation of what is actually happening, what's supposed to happen, what is the outcome, but then also puts that into context with the actual documentation and the explanation of what do we mean by saying X, right? So like behind X, there's a ton of more things we can actually explain, but the tool is not necessarily the right place. So we put it into documentation and hint the user to, you can find a lot more here in this place. And like this has also shown me one more thing throughout us like practicing documentation as part of the engineering team. It's also something where you can innovate, where you can bring in new things, right? It's not just like plain old markdown and you just write something and that's it. No, there are also like new ways of you have to explore and how you have to further emphasize to the user like how something is working, right? It doesn't just stop with, yeah, writing something up and that's it. For example, the typical case is like you have a command line, right? And you have like the command line has some kind of explanation, but then you get an error message. You have no clue what this error message means. Like you typically like you do an operation, then it gives you like not found. What was not found, right? It's like how can I explore further, like what is behind that, right? So like giving that context and also providing users more contextual help in that kind of situation. I think that was really like something which like the work Kisrana and the others have been doing, like really something which also showed me like there's a lot more we can do. We just have to bring the different kind of elements together for the work. Yeah, so that's from a pretty much high level kind of perspective of what we are doing and just day-to-day work practice. Like it's yeah, people implement features. We do that like as like all of the other engineering teams in Canonical, like typical workflow starts with writing a specification of what is the actual thing we want to develop. Then there's a discussion with people. We actually like explain to the other members on the team or even external stakeholders what is the impact of this, what are the different kind of risks we're tackling here, and how does the solution look like we want to implement. Once that went through like a review and approval process, we then actually went into the documentation. But what we started some time ago to do is that at that point, we already pretty much aware of what the documentation impact will be. So engineers are asked to actually explain already in the specification phase what kind of documentation has to be put in place, right? So it's not just an afterthought, like once you have done the implementation, we have to now document this, right? And like, it's like part of the first few things you do when you talk about something, because then you already see like it might have a much bigger impact than we initially thought, right? We just recently had something where we wanted to do something, and then there was the question, do we need to do a specification for this? It's quite simple change. We did that. It turned out also with documentation impact, there's much more than we actually initially thought, right? So thinking through this from all the different perspectives and also tells like, hey, we have to do something more for documentation than we initially thought. And then we can lay out a plan and we can actually make sure that once the actual implementation is done or while the implementation is happening, that also the documentation is being finished, right? Throughout that, there always comes up the kind of question, okay, like what was the priority of documentation? And that's something which is not necessarily the easiest thing to solve, because you need to set a priority not just for that particular task, right? Because you could say, yeah, we set up that work, we have planned like these couple of stories we have to implement, and then at the end, yeah, documentation comes that you still have to do. Maybe in between something else comes, which is then potentially higher priority, and then you just skip on the documentation part for a moment, right? But at least what I try to emphasize in the team is, right, so like we need to complete these things, and like not closing the documentation part of this means we miss the targets for a particular release we are going to bring out, right? Like we have, from our perspective, we have a pretty fixed kind of structure on how we are releasing our software, which has a strict cadence of like every month for a patch release and every 3 months for a feature release. And then we have like kind of set deadlines for documentation freeze, code freeze, and so on. So there's some room you can actually play with. Like if you say, okay, there's something else coming in between, but we cannot release, and you're going to risk the release if the documentation isn't done, right? So like there needs to be a clear kind of exception being granted by the release leadership team or like the leadership of the engineering team, to actually be allowed to not do the documentation, right? And that actually helped us, and it didn't really become a problem because it's just became a practice for everybody like over a while. But yeah, it needs to get started, and this also was all not something which just started overnight, right? Like it's a step-by-step kind of process, and we are still improving on that. But yeah, I think that's basically like from the inside, from what we have been doing in the team, and how documentation actually has become like a strong part of the work we do on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, are there any questions from anyone or discussion points?
So I can break the ice. I just had a question that I wanted. So I wasn't here when the product started. So I wanted to ask for my benefit and others as well. So has your outlook changed since you started and now? So because you wouldn't have had this same stability when you started out versus now?
It's definitely something that has evolved over the years, right? I would say something else, right? Because like you have to start somewhere, and you often start small, because like going for the big, like complete kind of process and scenery, that's not necessarily going to like go right. In the beginning, it was me plus another half engineer. So there was some room to do something, but we also had to run towards certain deadlines. Like we were sure, like not doing documentation in the full kind of spectrum as we are doing today, but in the necessary kind of framing, which was necessary to allow somebody else to get started, right? Potentially more technical people, not so much like so much non-technical people. But I would say it evolved over time. But it went pretty quickly into like an actual documentation set rather than just like a few readmes and like a Google Doc somewhere, right? Because it turned out, hey, we actually have to give this to people, and we also have to give this to people we are not necessarily talking to, right? When you're talking to people in a direct conversation, you can often like direct them in different kind of direction. But if you don't do that, and at some point it also doesn't scale anymore because you have too many people you would need to talk to, you have to somehow put this into a better place. And that's, I think, like within the first one and a half years that became a thing. It wasn't what it is today. It was still like a set of documents and some kind of categorization, not following dire taxes by any means. But yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so thanks, Simon. So you put quite a bit of an emphasis on the fact that you are closed source, which puts slightly more pressure on your product, which like I think that's yes, but then again, I don't think it should be an excuse for any of us that don't run open closed source products, because everything that you said applies the same, right?
Yes.
Even if it's open source, then it maybe just somebody can't read the source, right?
Yes, you're absolutely right, Mikael. Like I think it's not an excuse. Like I've just tried to explain a bit more of why, because like I've been working on a lot of open source software before as well, and like documentation was not necessarily always the top priority, right? Because yeah, we publish the source code. Potentially somebody can read it. Often people don't read it because they just want to make use of it. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It should not be an excuse that there is a source code, because the source code may also not be easy to understand because software is complicated, right? We for example, we're dealing with a lot of complicated open source projects in Anbox Cloud. Like, for example, you can think about Chromium or Android by itself, which is like, you cannot really say like you're understanding everything they are doing in Android because it's just too complicated. It can also not be easily documented, right? So I think there's a challenge, like how far do you actually go, right? Whether it's like where's the point, like now it's time to look into the source code. But yeah, you're absolutely right. One thing maybe to add to this, which helped us quite a bit, is we also started some work to actually get a better understanding for who are our users, right? So like if you know who your users, right? So one from which kind of perspective they are coming, right? So for example, if we talk about the Linux kernel, like you often have pretty technical people who are dealing with that kind of piece, right? Like you have people who may understand what a scheduler is and what the kind of elements and pieces and knobs are which you can tune if they come to kernel documentation, right? If they are just like a user and they want to like do some writing or whatever else, they may not necessarily need that, right? So understanding the target audience of your documentation, that's something we put some work towards to as well. That helped us also like to better structure our thoughts about what is it actually we need to document, right? Because there are a lot of details which you can document, but if that's not actually helpful for users to achieve the job, it may not be your top priority of what should be documented, right?
And to add to this, so it's probably not a one-way street, understanding your users and then providing the right documentation. It's probably also the other way around. By providing an appropriate documentation, you can probably also attract some specific users and customers, or you push them away because you just have a documentation, no documentation, or documentation that is only digestible by very tech-savvy people, for example.
Yeah, absolutely right, Nico. Like there's two sides of it, right? So like on the one side, like we as engineers who are working on the software, we understand it, right? We know what it is, and that's often like complicated as well, which is why I really like getting new people on board, right? Because you get asked so many interesting questions, right? Like we have been working on this for like almost 7 years by now. And we have been taking decisions in the beginning, which like I argue myself today with as well, like why have we been taking, right? But people are asking me these questions because they're coming new to this. It may sound odd in a current context, right? The world has moved on. But that's also often really helpful to just get a perspective of what you may not have thought about before. You can also have like a good element you put into documentation to just better explain to people why these decisions have been taken, right?
Okay. Would there be any more questions or comments on what Simon was talking about?
Just one more comment. So what I personally find usually quite helpful when I start with something, delving into a new project or something like this, and reading documentation, is to start with a high-level overview and see how things fit together, high-level concepts, understanding these high-level concepts before I then, specifically if I'm new to the topic, before I then can delve deeper and start with a tutorial or whatever, get hands-on dirty. So understanding the big picture, how things fit together, that's always very beneficial for me to understand things.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot. It was an interesting perspective and of course hands-on, so it's valuable. I'm gonna turn off the recording now unless there's anything else to share, and then we can go into an informal discussion.